Good to be with you again. It's been a while. For those of you who don't know, my name is Phil Stevenson. Really have appreciated spending time with River's Edge Church as I can. A good friend of Pastor Dave's. Excited about what God is doing through him and you as you continue to minister together in this community. This morning, we're going to talk about somebody probably most of us have some awareness of. His name is Gideon, and we're going to first encounter him in the book of Judges, Judges chapter 6. We will have some scripture verses on the screen, but if you like to turn to your own, whether it's you have a Bible with you or whether you use an iPhone, iPad, as I do many times with scripture, you can turn there as well. And I just want to remind you, there is, when you came in, many of you received this. If you like to kind of track along through taking notes, then I would encourage you to do so. But I would say that Gideon, for most of us, is best known for a couple of things. He's known for actually defeating a large army with about 300 men and some clay pots and some torches. And then he's also known for the fleece, where he was the guy, and maybe you've heard this story, where he put a fleece on the ground and he wanted to confirm that God was really directing him. So he said, God, would you have the fleece stay wet and all the ground around it be dry? And that's what happened. And then, of course, he wasn't sure that really was God speaking to him. And so then he said, well, how about if you have the fleece dry and all the ground around it wet? And so he was kind of a fleece guy, if you please. And many times we may have heard that phrase, we're going to put a fleece before the Lord. And that's where it comes from. Well, we're going to be talking about this gentleman because what Gideon does for us, I believe, is that he represents, at least the story we're going to look at, about a faith journey. Every single one of us here this morning, every single individual who is, or family members that are listening online this morning, I want you to know that all of us are in a faith journey. Some of you are further along in that than others. Some of you haven't even felt like you've quite stepped into that faith journey, but somewhere, all of us are on this spectrum of trying to discover our faith for ourselves. I love the story about college students because when I was a college student as well, that's when I really began to wrestle to make my faith my own. I was a person of faith. I accepted Jesus Christ into my life when I was in junior high, but I'm not sure I really worked it out for myself until I got into college. And so those kinds of ministries are so important for college students. But what I want us to see here is that we are going to have this story about Gideon, who I said defeated an army, a large army, a huge army with 300 people, 300 men, and some clay jars and torches. Now, here's the thing about this. Many times, you and I encounter somebody we believe of great faith. They seem to really maybe have a deep prayer life. They really seem to know what it means to trust God, and we see them, and rightly so, we admire that in them. But sometimes we forget that they weren't always that way. They had to go through a process of becoming that kind of individual, just like Gideon had to go through a process of becoming an individual who trusted God enough that he would accept the task of taking 300 men to defeat a large army. And what I want to do is give you a brief Twitter version of where we discover Gideon this morning. Because we're going to look at Gideon in chapter 6. Now, it's in chapter 7 where he defeats this army, but that's not what we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to take a look at chapter 6 to see where Gideon started from. And here's a little bit of the Twitter background of where we find Gideon. Frankly, the children of Israel had been disobedient to God. And as a result of them, he put them under the heel, if you please, of the Midianites. And here's how this fleshed out in real life, is when they began to be taken over by the Midianites, what would happen is that the Midianites would wait until the Israelites had grown their crops, and then they'd be swooping in, and they would come in, and because they were a stronger force, they would take all of their crops, they would take many of their herds, and so they were leaving the children of Israel destitute, if you please. And that was, frankly, a result of some of the choices that they made. But then we find out, of course, like any of us would, is they get to a point where they finally cry out to God. And God listened to them. It says in the latter part of verse 6, and it says this of chapter 6 of Judges, "Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. When they cried out to the Lord because of Midian, the Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites." And so we're going to discover in this encounter that this prophet, or this angel of the Lord, as referred to in verse 11, shows up to recruit the person who is going to be the key ingredient to God delivering the children of Israel from the Midianites. And we're going to take a look at this, and he is going to find Gideon, who is in a wine press, who is threshing wheat. And that's going to be significant as we look at this. You see, in a wine press is where Gideon was, but that is not where Gideon would stay. But this is where Gideon is going to begin this faith journey. And we're going to start there with Gideon when he has this encounter with this angel of the Lord as he is in this wine press threshing wheat. And that's going to begin his faith journey. And what I really want to do is just kind of meander through a few passages and make some observations. And I think that they will help us maybe identify many of these with ourselves in our own faith journey and where we are and where we would like to be. And the first observation is this: God knows and understands exactly where we are. It says in verse 11, "Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree of Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abzeri. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a wine press." Now let me just stop right there. Why is that somewhat significant? Well, because he's threshing wheat, and in that culture at that time, you did not obviously thresh wheat in a wine press. Where you typically would thresh wheat would be that you would be someplace, typically on an elevated place, where there's a little bit of a breeze, and then they would have a winnowing fork. I got it. Okay. And then they would take this, and it was an old contraption. Of course, obviously, they don't do that today. And they would take the sheaves of wheat that were there, and they would have something underneath it, and then they would take this winnowing fork, and they would kind of throw the wheat up in the air, the sheaves, and then the heavier wheat kernels would fall to the ground, and then the breeze would take some of the sheaf away. And that's how they would normally do that. Now, wine presses were typically located in that day at the bottom of hills or in valleys. Why? Because a lot of grape and stalks and those kind of things were on hillsides, and so obviously it's easier to carry bunches of grapes down a hill than to tote them up a hill. So here is Gideon when this angel come along, and he is threshing wheat in a wine press. Not the most optimum situation. And the reason the reason he did that is goes on and says, threshing wheat at the bottom of a wine press to hide the grain from the Midianites. So what was he doing? He was there threshing wheat in the not the most optimum situation in a wine press. He was doing it partly out of fear of the Midianites, of course, and partly out of necessity. He had to hide this so that he himself could keep this for himself instead of having the Midianites come in and grab it from him. God knows where you are and I am on our spiritual journeys. And here's the thing. Often you and I, we invest too much time attempting to get someplace else to begin our journey. And that, folks, that's not how it works. Just like the angel of the Lord is visiting Gideon in a wine press, and the reason he is because that's where Gideon is, and he visits him there. You see, here's the deal. In our faith journeys, we always begin where we are. So wherever you are in your faith journey, it could be a nebulous belief in the existence of God. That actually is part of our faith journey. And wherever you are, that's where you begin. Don't worry about trying to get someplace else so you can begin your faith journey. Begin right where you are, whatever level you are. That's where our faith journey begins. And God knows exactly where you are. The second observation is this: God sees our potential. Now, and again, let's try to picture this the best we can. Here is Gideon. He's in a wine press, threshing wheat, which we already know is not the most optimum place to be. And he's doing that, why? Because he's fearful of the Midianites. And here's the greeting that he gets. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero." Does that seem kind of odd to you? Mighty hero. And in some translations, it's mighty warrior. So here's this guy who is fearful of the Midianites. He's threshing wheat in a wine press, and the angel of the Lord shows up and says, "Hey, mighty hero." And at some point, Gideon might be like, you talking to me? Because he wasn't a mighty hero. He was frightened. He was a mighty nothing. But here's what we have to understand in our faith journey is that God sees not only what we are doing, but what we can do. God sees not only who we are, but what we can become. God sees in you and God sees in me many times things that we cannot see in ourselves. You may look at an acorn laying on the ground and see an acorn. God sees an oak tree. And that's what we begin to see about ourselves, that God sees us for who we are. God sees our potential. And we have to recognize that, because that's part of our faith journey, knowing that God sees our potential and He wants to continue to develop that in us. The third observation I want to make is this: God is not put off by our discouragement. God is not put off by our discouragement. And if you've been walking with the Lord or just beginning your faith journey with the Lord, there are times of discouragement. And we see this come out in Gideon. Because first of all, this angel approaches him and says, "Mighty hero," and he says, "The Lord is with you." And that basically bothers Gideon. In essence, at some level, he's done with that kind of nonsense. And we read this in verse 13 where he says, "Sir," at least he's being kind. Gideon replied, "If," now and I emphasize that "if," and very clearly, because that's, I believe, where Gideon was. If the Lord is with us, which means I'm not sure He is, but if, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites. See, Gideon's not in a great mood right here. Can you blame him? He's threshing wheat in a wine press, not the most optimum situation. And then we have this guy show up, and all of a sudden he's calling him this mighty hero, which he really knows in his spirit he does not feel that way. And so now he's going to kind of take this person to task, and he says, "Okay, here's the deal. If the Lord, why is this going on?" It might be equivalent to us sometimes in our frustrations in our life saying, "I've heard all those stories in Sunday school class, or I heard those things preached on at church, or I read, but where are they now? That's just history. What good are they?" And I would imagine there's not a one of us here that sometime in the last 18 months, through all the stuff that we've gone through, all the adversity, all this and all that, at some point, some of us didn't say, "Where's God?" I have. "What are you doing, God? Look what's going on around us. Look at all this vitriol. Look at all this arguing. Look at all this stuff happening around us. Where is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Where is the God of Paul and Peter? Where is that God?" And that's where He is. And it's true. The challenges of life can often negate perspective. And that's where Gideon is. So as we go through our faith journeys, there is no doubt that we have times of discouragement. We wonder what's going on in our life, what's going on in our world, what's going on around us. Where is the God that I felt so strongly in these other situations and I don't feel so strongly His presence now? And I want us all to be reminded, God is not put off by our discouragements. He's not. He continues to be present and work in our lives, even at those times when we even find ourselves like Gideon saying, if the Lord is with us, why? And we've all asked those questions. And you say, well, I've never asked that question. Give yourself time. Give yourself some time. And you will. The next observation is God empowers what we have. And I love this. It's almost like the angel didn't quite want to go toe-to-toe with him on that. Instead, he just kind of goes on. He says in verse 14, then the Lord turned to him and said, go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. Wow. He is simply asking Gideon to start with the strength that he has. You see, we tend to complain about what we don't have instead of capturing what we do have. We focus on deficits instead of forging ahead with our assets. See, God is not asking Gideon for anything but what he is capable of, are you ready for this? At that moment. Because what do you say? He's saying, don't get new strength, don't get new muscles, don't do this. Just go with the strength you have right now. Gideon, you have something. Just go with that. The other day, literally this last week, where Joni and I live, we live in they like to call what they call an active adult community. You know, we're 55 years of age and older, and you say, are you over 55? Yes, I am. I know, 56, 57, right in there. Anyway, and I kind of laugh because they call it active adult because we can move around a little bit on our own. That's what it comes down to. So we have a fitness center in our community, and so I was up there and I was on the treadmill. I was kind of running away there at my speed. I don't want to mislead you. I was kind of running on this treadmill, and I had my earbuds in because I typically, I don't know about you, if you ever walked or run on a treadmill, you need distraction. Because let's be honest, that's one of the most boring things in the world to do. You do it because you think you're going to get results, or you hope you're going to get results. And so I had my earbuds in listening to my typical distraction, which is ESPN. And it was on the screen there. And all of a sudden this guy, I don't know him, older guy. Now, if I think he's older, he was older. And so he comes walking by the treadmill. And because we have this big way, the treadmill's here, and then there's a big wide aisle, and then there's some other stuff up there. And so he goes walking by, and literally he stops by me. He starts doing this. Then he says something to me. Well, I can't hear him because I got my earbuds in. I sometimes can't hear, and I don't have my earbuds in, but I definitely did not hear him. So I kept going. I took my earbud out, and I said to him, excuse me? And he said, it's so nice to be young. And I thought to myself, this guy's becoming my new best friend. And then I just said to him, well, I'm really not that young. And he says, well, I can never run like that. Now I'm getting a little bit more puffy up in there. And then I just said to him, all you can do at any age is what you can do. That was it. And that's what God is saying right here to us. That's it. All you can do where you are right now is what you can do. But at least start there. At least start there. Because God's going to empower what we have. The next one is God is not limited by our history. I love this. Because like many of us, when Gideon is challenged with something spiritually, when we're challenged with something spiritually, typically our first response is why we can't do that. Isn't that true? Well, we won't have a raise of hands or anything, but I think it's mostly true. And that's exactly what Gideon does here. He says, but Lord, Gideon replied, how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family. And here's what he's saying. Of course, the children of Israel made up of 12 tribes. And he's saying, of these 12 tribes, my tribe is the weakest one. Manasseh is the weakest one. My tribe and that is the weakest one. And not only that, I am the least one in my tribe. So he's saying, how can I do it? I am the least of the least of the least of the least. That's it. But God is not limited by our history. And how many times have we not allowed God to do something in our life or do something through our lives because we look at our history, we look at, say, well, you don't understand what my family background was like. You don't understand my past. You don't understand my inadequacies. You don't understand the decisions that I've made have not been the best decisions to make. So we immediately say, no, you can't use me. But in our willingness to be used by God, He'll use us. We need to allow God to use us where we are, because He certainly cannot use us where we are not. And we may have all kinds of excuses of why that can't be, but God wants to work in us and through us, and that's the next thing that He says. The next observation is God will join us. But the Lord said to him, and all of that you just said, the least of the least of the least of the least. And he actually said this to him previously, but he was so busy not really understanding, he finally just said, the Lord said, I will be with you. And you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. I will be with you. We could kind of do a subsetting there and simply say, well, God might say, everything you said, Gideon, was really true, except for you've left out one part. I'm going with you. I'm just not saying, go on, good luck, you'll do great. I'm going to go with you. I'm going to go with you. But now, Gideon is at a decision point. It's where all of us are in our decision points. And this is what we have to do in our faith journey. We must get out of our wine press. Verse 17 and 18, Gideon replied, if you're truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that is really the Lord speaking to me. Now catch this. He says in verse 18, don't go away until I come back and bring my offering to you. And that phrase, don't go away till I come back. What is he saying? He's going to get out of the wine press. Why? Because he has to get out of the wine press to go take care of this thing. And so he's saying, I'm by his actions, I'm getting out of this wine press. I'm getting out of this situation where I was threshing wheat, which is the most optimum because I was fearful. Now he's still a long way off from defeating the Midianites with 300 guys and some clay pots and some torches. In fact, here's what we have to recognize too. God doesn't tell him how he's going to use him to defeat the Midianites. He just says he's going to use them. And this is just my perspective. I think the reason he didn't, because if here's Gideon, he said, be right back, I'm going to get out of the wine press, and he's starting to climb over that wine press wall, and all of a sudden the angel of the Lord says, oh, by the way, it's only going to be with 300 guys and some clay pots and torches. He would get right back in and say, whoa, let's just hold on a minute here. Did I hear you correctly? The Midianites, who are a massive group of people, with a massive, 300? No. He wasn't ready for that yet. His faith hadn't been built up for that yet. But it all was going to begin with his willingness to get out of the winepress. You and I, we will never achieve what we might do until we act on what we can do. And what could Gideon do at that point? Get out of the wine press. There you go. He could do that. He had the ability to climb out of that wine press. In that simple action of getting out of the wine press, then everything would follow that. He began a journey, yes, that in chapter 7 is going to be wrapped up with the defeat of a Midianite army with 300 men, some clay pots, and some torches. But it all began with getting out of the winepress. And here's the thing. You all out online have wine presses that we find ourselves in. What is a wine press? It is our self-imposed limitations. It is our protection against the outside forces that can rail against our faith. It is our means of avoiding the challenges to our faith journey. In our wine presses, we kid ourselves that thinking we are doing okay. Getting in the wine press could make an argument. I'm doing okay. I'm getting by in my current reality. But there was more than that. Because the minute Gideon stepped out of his wine press, and it was going to open up a whole new avenue for him. When we step out of our wine presses, it'll open up things that we never imagined before. Gideon had a physical wine press, absolutely, but it represented what? He was fearful of any kind of reprisal from the Midianites, and when he got out of that wine press, he defeated the Midianites. All throughout Scripture, we see where men and women have to get out of their wine presses. Moses' wine press was his sense of inadequacy. But God used him to deliver the nation of Israel out of captivity. David's wine press was the perception of how he would appear to his brothers and others when he defeated Goliath. Daniel's wine press was the expectation of others in a culture that he did not share, that he was taken in captivity to, and his wine press was trying to abide by that culture, yet he influenced the entirety of that culture. Paul's wine press, I should say Peter's wine press, was that he had to give up his profession, fishing. And then he led the early church. And Paul's wine press was that he was an advocate and an avid person who persecuted the early Christians, sending many of them to their death. But he ended up being the most influential voice in the early church and even to this day in Christianity. We all have wine presses. And I want to share with you, what can that be? How can we move from our wine presses to our battlefields? And just three things. I want to give them to you here. First one is this: begin where you are. If you want to move from your wine press, you have to begin where you are. God's starting point, as I've already shared with you this morning, is where you are. You can't begin any place else but where you are. And the minute we begin to believe and buy into the fact that we have to be somewhere else, we are missing the opportunity for God to use us. See, it makes little difference where you begin from. It's that you begin. It makes little difference where you begin from. It's that you begin. So the first one is begin where you are. The second one is be who you are. God has created all of us, each of us, as we are, with gifts and skills and experiences and actions and attitudes. He's created this way. And He will take us as we are. But in His mercy and in His grace, as He continues to form us, even though He takes us where we are, He molds us. In fact, we have to understand this vital reality. God always accepts you. God always accepts me. God always accepts each of us where we are. But He never leaves us there. That's the great news. He accepts us each where we are, but He never leaves us there. And the third thing is we begin where we are, we be who we are, and this is the most significant part of this. You have to belong to God. That is our key to our faith journeys. That's the key to our faith development, is to belong to God. When we belong to God, even in those times when we're discouraged and doubtful, but we say we're going to hang in there, we're going to hold on to that shard or that shred of faith that we have. If we belong to God, He will get us from where we are to where we need to be in the time we need to get there. It's more a matter of whose you are, not who you are. It's more of a matter of whose we are, not who we are. March 17th, some of you that will immediately ring a bell, is St. Patrick's Day. Now, St. Patrick, by the way, I think we kind of know this. He was a real guy. And of course, St. Patrick's Day has become basically corned beef, cabbage, green beer. Chicago dyes their riverway green. It's about, at least when I was a kid growing up, this is abuse now, but when I was growing up, if you go to school and you don't wear green, you get pinched, all this kind of stuff. That's what we think St. Patrick's Day is. And that really is what it is now, but that's the person that supposedly is celebrated on that day was a real individual. In fact, he lived in England. His family was a church-going family. He wasn't necessarily himself a person of faith, but he was 16. Some raiders from Ireland came in and snatched him along with others and took him away to captivity to Ireland. And for 6 years, he served as a slave in Ireland. And it was during those 6 years that he began to kind of develop his own faith. We talked about that. His family was a church-going family, if you want to call it that. But he himself is not necessarily, but he began in captivity, began to develop this. And the story goes he had a dream. And in this dream, he saw a boat that was going to take him back to England. And so the next morning, he felt that was God speaking to him. And so he looked for an opportunity to escape, knowing that indeed, if he got caught, there would be dire consequences. But he was able to get to the coast, and he found a ship. He got on it, took him back to England. And then when he was in England, back at home, he began to feel this call to ministry, and he actually became a priest, and then he became, over time, a bishop. And he spent 30 years back in his home country of England. But after 30 years, he felt compelled to go back to the country that had enslaved him. And at that time, the Irish were a rough bunch of folks. And human sacrificing was part of what they believed and all this kind of thing. But he felt compelled. After 30 years, he went back to the country that had enslaved him to take the good news of Jesus Christ to Ireland. And he spent 29 years in ministry. And in that 29 years, there were 100,000 baptisms, and 300 churches were started. What was St. Patrick's wine press? It was his position as bishop, and it was his prestige of serving the church that he served. Those were his wine presses, and he had to get out of that wine press to act on what God would have him to do. And he went back to Ireland. And here's what I want us to understand. We may not defeat an army with 300 people, some clay pots and torches. We may not lead a nation. We may not defeat a giant. We may not influence an entire culture. Or we may not have a ministry that produces 100,000 people being baptized in the faith and 300 churches. But here's what I think. Here's what I think. When we get out of our wine presses, whatever those are, God will use us to achieve things. God will transform our personal lives in such a way that we become a person we never dreamed we could become. And we achieve that thing which God would have for us to do that we never thought we could do. But it all starts with getting out of our wine press. We begin where we are, we be who we are, and we belong to God. On the back side of this note-taking guide, there is a kind of a snippet of what's called St. Patrick's Breastplate prayer. And breastplate, of course, was an armor that you put over in a battle to, of course, protect your upper body. And it's just a part of it. But it was a prayer that St. Patrick prayed regularly. And it's to remind us that as we get out of our wine press And we recall that God is with us. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. And I encourage you this week, even if you just do it for a week, 7 days, between now and next Sunday, put this someplace. And every morning, just read it. You can read it quietly or you can read it out loud to remind you that when you get out of your wine press, God has incredible things He wants to do in you and through you. And if every day we begin where we are, we be who we are, and we belong to God, it will be incredible what we will begin to see happen in and through our lives. Father,